I wanted to work in a sector that gave me passion and purpose. I wanted to solve a problem that was hard, and I wanted to operate in a niche. I didn't want to be sort of something that everybody liked, but something that a few people loved. And that's what we've sort of built Dexibit on, as being very important to favoured few rather than sort of meaningless to the masses. One of the things we've always prided ourselves in is making sure that the projections that we put out are realistic. They're not just like, here's a, I can draw a picture of a hockey stick as good as the next person. Doesn't necessarily mean that in the early days of the startup you can stand behind those numbers. So making sure that they are realistic. Yeah, I think probably as a cliche, we started as a failure. And we first of all thought that museum apps was the way to go. And so we built a museum app. And the reality is that people don't want to download museum apps. And if they do, they don't want to use it. And if they do, they don't like to. One of the hard things for founders when they're starting a business is that they all go into it with a really different idea of what real life is going to be like on the other side. And the problem with that is that founder life is very flashy on social media. This is kind of the problem, right? Like founder life is grind, and there's years of it ahead. I think one of the things that I learned the hard way was
Welcome to the Startup Theatre podcast with your host, Troy Hammond. This podcast is produced by Empire Films.
Hello and welcome to Startup Theatre. I'm Adrienne Muir. You may have noticed something a little bit different. Troy's handed me the keys to the podcast this week because he's in Turkey, I hear. Is he drinking coffee?
Terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. I'm Serge Van Dam. Thanks for joining us. I was feeling a bit lonely on the couch.
Who is it?
Well, what should we call him? Or her? I don't know if it's a him or her. I'm not going to judge.
This is good.
We'll call him Jono.
I'll call him Jono.
Jono, after an amazing producer.
This is good.
Jono. Yeah, Jono and I are sitting on the couch. We're going to have an amazing afternoon.
Excellent. Now tell me what's been going on with you this week, Serge?
I'm wearing the Carbon Invoice t-shirt. We've just been doing a planting action day, so planting a whole lot of trees in the Orongorongo Valley to offset some carbon.
Okay.
So the Carbon Invoice team organised some of these events. So that's kind of one of the things for this week.
Is that a regular thing that people can get involved in?
Yeah, once a month or so. Oh, actually, I think we're doing 20 or 30 of these during winter. You can only plant in winter in New Zealand and a little bit more flexible in Australia. Go to carboninvoice.com, find out more. That's what I've been up to. And continued a barrage of announcements around AI. So that's kind of making all the SaaS companies I'm involved with think deeply about their strategies.
Okay, great.
And what about you?
Well, this week I'm off to the UK tomorrow, so I think that the keys will get handed to you.
Yes, dangerous.
So
I'll be on my own.
Oh, Troy and Adrian are away, and Serge has got the couch. What are you going to do?
It is a secret.
It's a secret.
Only Jono and I know.
Are aware of it. Okay, I'm looking forward to this. This is great. Well, we're going to try something a bit different this week. What we're going to do is we're going to cut to Finn and ensure that we get the beautiful news that Finn gives us every time. So we're going to cut to Finn.
Well, hello, welcome back to Caffeine News. I usually get to do this in a much more interactive format, but this time you're just going to be inflicted with my takes for the next 5 minutes. But thankfully, there's a lot going on in the startup ecosystem, which is incredibly exciting. And we've got to start, of course, with one of the highlights of the startup ecosystem and the highlights of the calendar for the year. Electrify Aotearoa is back for its fourth installment, 24th and 25th of June. Caffeine is going to be in partnership with Electrify this year. And to kick that off, we had a great conversation with Marianne Johnson, who's the chair. She's an absolute legend. I mean, everyone familiar with this podcast is probably familiar with her. But if you're not, check out the conversation on Caffeine. It was a really, really interesting conversation around the why of Electrify. Why do we need this event? Why do we need to still be empowering female founders? And of course, everybody knows some of the stats around the fact that while female-led startups do actually do better by the numbers. They get a vanishingly small percentage of venture capital out there. I think it's about 7% of VC in New Zealand actually goes towards female-led startups, even though about 26% of startups are led by women. And while that sounds low, that's actually a decent number when we look at the international averages. So in some ways, we're doing well, but obviously there's a lot further to go. And so the 24th and 25th, they're doing a little bit different this year. If you're familiar with Electrify previously, it was always a one-day event, but something that Marion talked about was wanting to structure Electrify this year that in a way that better reflected the needs of the people actually going to it. And obviously, one of the things they're thinking about is, well, we want female founders to be coming to this and aspiring female founders. Their workflow and their work-life balance is often a lot different. If you're trying to juggle childcare, you don't really want to block out this whole day. So they've split it into 2 half days so people can kind of slot that into their calendar more effectively. And I thought that was just a really nice consideration of, we don't want to just put on a good event. We want to make this event actually work for the people who are coming. So the first day is going to be a little bit more intensive around workshops. Like, you're going to be hearing from real founders who have actually achieved so much in their startups, telling you practical advice you can walk away with. The second day is going to be a little bit more of the storytelling component. So they're going to structure it with, right from the beginning, from that concept stage, they're going to get a founder who's closer to that stage talking that through, and then every successive speaker will take you through the whole startup journey. And then the final talk will be about the exit, about the big close. And I think you can probably guess who's going to be talking on that, but if not, we'll just leave it to, it'll be a little bit of a surprise. Now, Electrify Aotearoa is going to be covered from both sides of this podcast marriage. The Startup Theatre guys are going to be there doing a special, so definitely check in on that. And Caffeine is in partnership. As I said, we've also got a giveaway for the second day of the conference. So if you haven't got your tickets, just email hello@caffeinedaily.co with why you should be there, and we will select someone to make sure that they get to that day 2 of Electrify, because honestly, it is genuinely one of the best events in startup, and I'm so jealous that I don't get to go down myself personally this year, but at least Startup Theatre is going to be represented. And if you are someone like me, who looks like me, cis white guy thinking, well, is this the kind of the event for me if it's focused on empowering female founders? I put that question to Marion in our chat, and I said, well, what should people like me do? And she just had such a good blunt answer, which was, just show up. Just show up. That's the best thing you can do, is be there, show up, ask that question, like, what can I do? What can I do to improve the situation? The worst thing you can do is ignore it, because that's how we end up in this situation in the first place. So, Electrify Aotearoa, it's coming up. Get excited. We're excited, and we're going to be there. And elsewhere in caffeine land, we've got a great profile this week of Max Ferguson, who we've also entered into a partnership with Lumen. So you'll be seeing a little bit more about Lumen and caffeine over the next couple of months. If you're not familiar, they're the PDF editing software, which is available for free. You've probably used them and not actually realized, because they've got about 100 million users worldwide. And they've scaled up from 2014, they got, after a couple of months of launch, 1 million users, and now they've hit that 100 million user mark. And so if you want to talk about a startup that recognized a problem and then managed to solve that problem, and at a global scale, you could really do worse than Lumen PDF. And what I love about them is they're quite understated in terms of the problem that they're solving. When we talk about the OpenStars and the Rocket Labs, those big deep tech guys, they're solving these sort of world-shattering problems, and it's kind of easy to pull headlines out of them. What I really liked about talking to Max was that they want to be a little bit invisible, but because their solution that they're offering, basically being able to edit PDFs easily and share information accessibly across different groups, it's simple, but it's also completely foundational, because a PDF is essentially the bridge between the tangible in-person world of meeting someone in the office and getting important documentation signed, and the frictionless online world of the internet. The reason the PDF is so important is because it's still basically the only tool we've got for representing important documentation that's physical in digital space. And so that's one of my first questions to him. I was like, why does everyone still struggle with PDFs? Like, why do they matter? And he gave me a really good history lesson, which if you check out the article on Caffeine, all about how Adobe first invented it in 1994, and then they realized that they needed to open source it because it was weird to try and constrict it. But he basically talked a lot about how Lumen's goal here is making PDF editing easy and accessible. That's not the only thing they do. There's a lot of other tools, and obviously there's a whole conversation around AI that's coming in here. I won't try and put words in his mouth. You should read the article if you want to find out more. But he spoke to the vision of Lumen really well, which was it's about building a trust engine. It's about making interactions and transactions that take place online being as trusted as they are in the real world. If I send you something to sign and you sign it and you send it back, how do both parties know that the person on the other side of that is who they say they are? And obviously, if you start solving for that, you are setting yourself up incredibly well for the world that emerging technology is creating. Because this core problem of who can we trust online, who can we trust when we're making these interactions, we're making these deals, is just being so supercharged by generative artificial intelligence. And Lumen is doing a lot of work with both NGOs, with businesses on the ground, and also with governments. He gestured at it, didn't get into too many specifics, but he said, we're working with government pilots around the world of how do you say digitize driver's licenses? How do you digitize different forms of ID? How do we incorporate that into Lumen? And they're really building something that I think is going to be so important and is so often under-discussed, or the oxygen in the room gets sucked out by people like Sam Altman, if you aren't familiar, is while running OpenAI, also building this incredible weird verification hardware, which is like an eyeball that you stare into, scans you, puts you onto a blockchain somewhere, and that's how you can prove you're a human. That's very much a case of inventing the problem and then also selling the solution. But I really liked talking with Max because he had such a great vision of how a Kiwi startup who started from a pretty humble base, how do we make PDFs better to use, and ended up with how do we solve trust on the internet? And that's a pretty impressive arc, and it really speaks to the kind of big picture thinking and aspirational vision that you can have as a founder. So definitely check that out. We're going to have a couple more conversations with Max that will roll out over the coming weeks, but part one is on Caffeine right now. And finally, we just talked about AI with the Lumen piece there, and we kind of like to finish these Caffeine spots with a bit of a conversation piece. And it really does feel like the conversation around AI has shifted somewhat in the last couple of weeks. Obviously, the AI piece is absolutely everywhere. But for the last couple of months to maybe the last 12, it's been a little bit more excited, I thought. Most people are now familiar with ChatGPT. Most people are familiar with the benefits of these generative AI tools. And I think a lot of people are just being gobsmacked about how useful it can be. But I think it's starting to turn somewhat of these alarm bells are ringing of these are incredibly useful. These can do a lot of my job. And the obvious following thought is, how soon is it going to be before it is doing my job? And the World Economic Forum just released a survey, I think this week, which said that 40% of all the employers they interviewed, and they interviewed a lot, were anticipating reducing their workforce between 2025 and 2030. 40% of all employers. And that, depending on who you talk to, could be lowballing it. So I think while we often touch on the AI piece from a kind of a narrow perspective of like, well, what's it good for your business? How are you applying it? How are you getting those efficiencies? I think it's really important to not lose the forest for the trees here of we're living through what promises to be the most radical technological transformation ever, and it's going to happen on the shortest time frame. You know, these things that we talked about of widespread automation were always way in the future. They were always something that might happen in 2050, or maybe happen in 2040. Really think back. ChatGPT is 2 years old, and think about how much of a different world we're living in now. So I just wonder, for you, the audience, how are you feeling about your relationship with AI, and how secure are you in the job that you're doing right now? Because we all say founders do every job in the business. Sure. But I think the story of the past 12 months is that island of things that only people can do, that in our case would say only founders can do, seems to be shrinking really, really rapidly. And I just wonder how you guys think about future-proofing whatever your startup is, future-proofing whatever your business is. How do you know the thing you're doing isn't going to be automated in 12 to 24 months? I wish I could give you the answer, and if anyone knows, they're going to be much better paid than I am. But I do think if I could give one takeaway bit of advice is don't take your eye off this ball, because however fast you think it's moving, I'm pretty sure it's moving a lot faster. And now I get to say something that I haven't got to say since I worked in news. Back to you in the studio.
All right, Finn, thank you very much for the news. That was very newsworthy news for everybody. We're going to do Spotlight on Startups. This segment is brought to you by Talent Army. Well, in fact, not really brought to you by Talent Army because they're not even here, the No Talent Army. But anyway, let's talk about three startups that we like or we want to talk about. First one from me is Tutaki. Tutaki is the Māori word for meeting, tutaki.com, Tutaki. It's an AI board secretariat. So I use it for some of the boards that I'm on. Basically, I can upload all the documents. I can summarize things. I can get it to ask me questions. I can ask questions myself. So Jamie Green's CEO there doing an amazing job. So that's Tutaki. Also, shout out to a company I've been involved with for a while called Tapi. Tapi is a property maintenance automation software selling to property managers in New Zealand, Australia, and soon to go elsewhere. Amazing product, amazing team led by the founders Taylor and Tal. Go to tapihq.com if you want to find out more. Adrian, do you have any startups on your side?
Yeah, I've been talking to Diana Mene, who is a previous COO here in Wellington. You would have come across her. She has a startup called Astronaut. That's spelled Astronort. And what she's doing is she's really harnessing the AI tools that we were talking about out there and making it a lot better in terms of data analytics for CEOs and for small businesses. So she's doing a lot of work for us at the moment, and we're having a look at some of her product, and it's going well.
Awesome. That's the Spotlight on Startups.
Okay, so this week, who have we got? We've got Angie Judge, who is our CEO and founder of Dexibit, who is, an incredible woman in terms of everything she's done. But more importantly, we've had a number of people reach out to us saying, are you going to get Angie Judge on?
What should we get her to talk about? What should we prod her on?
So, look, I feel like Ange is going to be the person that we can really tap into and understand at depth the journey of a founder, right? She has been doing this for probably over 10 years now. I think she's only 40, right? She's been on this for forever. And I think the reality is for her, it has been a tough journey. And I feel like Ange is a person we can talk to about that co-founder kind of conversation. She's talking about the culture of her business. I think that'd be really great if we can get a little bit more into that. For me, it's making sure that we understand a bit more about not just Ange as a female founder, but Ange as a founder. And I feel like that could be really interesting for us.
So up and close and personal.
I think so. I think that, Ange will be really open and honest, and that's what we need. You and I talk all the time about, we've done our own co-founder journeys ourselves and how tricky it's been and the grind that it takes and the hard work and dedication. But sometimes there's really shitty things that happen. And it's so easy for us to talk about the great things that happen. We see the exits and we see the stories. But I do think sometimes if I'm listening to a podcast like this, I also want to hear the nuggets, the things that can really help me on my journey. And I'm really hoping that we can get some of that out of Ange today.
Let's do this.
Let's do it.
Today's guest is brought to you by Vanta. Whether you're starting or scaling your company's security program, demonstrating top-notch security practices and establishing trust is more important than ever. Vanta automates compliance for global frameworks like ISO 27001 and SOC 2, saving you time and money, helping you build customer trust. Over 8,000 global companies like Atlassian, Dovetail, Sharesies and Flossy all use Vanta to manage risk and improve security in real time. I actually had dinner with the whole Vanta team and I knew instantly that they would be the sponsor on the podcast. They just genuinely care about startups, and to make it go even one better, they've actually decided that my audience gets a special offer of $1,000 USD off from Vanta. All you have to do is go to vanta.com/startup theatre and enjoy your $1,000 USD off now.
Hey, it's great to have you here, Angie. How are you?
I am excellent.
It is great to have you on board. I don't know if you know this, but when Troy put a call out to who we wanted to have on the podcast, this is some time ago, your name came up more than 20 times. So we are super excited to have you on the podcast. It's going to be great.
Welcome. Lovely to see you again.
You too.
So, Angie, listen, tell me, for those who don't, and they should, if they've been living under a rock perhaps, who don't know about Dexibit and about what you've been up to, can you just give us a little bit of insight into what Dexibit does and what you've been up to in the last, how long it's been?
Yeah, sure. We're a Kiwi SaaS company, and we do data analytics specifically for visitor attractions. So we work with cultural institutions like museums, galleries, zoos, parks, and also commercial attractions like theme parks and stadiums. And we're based here in Auckland, but serve a global customer base. Some of our bigger names internationally, iconic household names like the Smithsonian, the National Gallery, the Field Museum, the Rock Hall of Fame, Aquarium of the Pacific, and Obama's new presidential center up in Chicago.
That is incredible.
What a lineup.
Yeah, what a lineup. That's something I haven't come across before. Hey, Angie, though, but listen, where did this come from, though? Where did the idea come from? Because you had a bit of a corporate background, I believe, and then you sort of decided you saw a gap in the market, or you saw a problem that needed to be solved. Tell us a bit about that. Where did it kind of start for you?
Yeah, the official story is that I was on holiday in DC, saw a security guard at the Smithsonian with a clicker counter, and he was manually clicker counting people into the museum. And I don't know a lot of people here know, but the Smithsonian's actually made up of 19 national museums, 2 or 3 more on the way, and a zoo as well. So they see tens of millions of people through the door. And here they were sort of starting with some very rudimentary manual data to understand their visitors and their visitor experience. These days, of course, they use Dexibit for that, and it's a whole different world. But that was one of the kind of inspirational moments. But truth be told, I think Dexibit was probably years in the making. Before that, my father had started and sold a couple of tech companies, so it was always like software specs and business plans at the kitchen table. I'd got into corporate technology with Hewlett-Packard, and then an Israeli telecommunications software company called Amdocs. And it was just right on the verge of when companies like Xero and Vend were making it big. So SaaS was becoming a thing. We were still very much on-prem in the old school way, and I was itching to go into the SaaS world. And when I figured that was going to be quite a long, slow burn in the corporate one, I really wanted to make the leap and make the most of getting amongst that business model, getting into the data and analytics space more heavily, and this was my chance.
That's pretty gutsy, right, though? Because, Ange, how long ago was this that you actually sat around the table and thought, I'm gonna jump, make the leap?
Do you know what? I think it was coming up 10 years, which I was just thinking about on the drive here. It's actually quite a long time ago. And, that's a quarter of my life, half of my adult life now. Like, it's quite a long period of time to invest in your life's work. So, big milestone.
And why this problem, Angie? Obviously you said your father's background, you've been influenced by the tech sector generally. You saw a guard counting the visitor numbers, but, what's the real why of this sector and this problem to solve?
Yeah, I'd always gone to museums and loved them as a kid. Was not allowed to study history at school. I sort of bent my parents' arm and got away with photography for a year at the end there, but I was told that that sort of thing was for hobbies, not for profession. And so lo and behold, maths and science followed, and so did software engineering. So it was always sort of a lifelong passion to go back into, well, I shouldn't say back into, but go into an industry like that. And I'd ended up before that at Amdocs in the telecommunications sector, which just bored me out of my brains. Like, trying to help people make a phone call is not that exciting. I can nowadays work in some of the most inspirational places in the world. I've seen some of the things that I never would have seen in my life, and been to places I've never would have been otherwise. Seen the tomb of James Smithson, who started the Smithsonian. Like, I have been in the room where the kings had their wives beheaded and all sorts of things, and just, really seen and understood the world. And I wanted to work in a sector that gave me passion and purpose. I wanted to solve a problem that was hard. And I wanted to operate in a niche. I didn't want to be sort of something that everybody liked, but something that a few people loved. And that's what we've sort of built Dexibit on, as being very important to favoured few rather than sort of meaningless to the masses.
Awesome.
Yeah, I mean, solving a problem that's hard. I mean, everyone goes in with that, but you certainly have, for sure. In terms of the team and what you've done over time, and when you started, how did it sort of start for you? Was it just sort of 3 man in a coat stand? Was it an idea around the table? You had a co-founder. You've obviously got a bigger team now, and you're situated across, globally. Actually, how did it sort of start for you, and how did you pull those people together?
Yeah, I think probably as a cliche, we started as a failure. And we first of all thought that museum apps was the way to go. And so we built a museum app. And the reality is that people don't want to download museum apps. And if they do, they don't want to use it. And if they do, they don't like to. And they're very difficult for the visitor attraction to service, and even harder for the company to support. So we sort of recognised quite early on that wasn't going to be the go, but discovered in the process that actually people loved the data off the back of them, and that was the real gold at the bottom of the well. And so that's where Dexibit grew from sort of an idea and an app at the kitchen table, back through to, we went through Icehouse or Ice Angels, I think they were back then, did a family and friends and an angel, and then eventually a micro venture round to get the team up and running, at which point I'd already been working free for, I think, a year at that point. We were able to bring on some others full time and grew the team from there.
I remember actually catching up with you when we were in London and sitting around the table talking. You'd been to some conference and you were like, basically I get everyone to attend. We get a Google spreadsheet, we go into a room, we sit there, we're doing real-time analytics on what these people are saying, we're feeding it back to the team. And I was like, holy moly, mate, like you were a powerhouse back then, making sure that all the information was coming in, which I think was so critical. And I took a lot away from that conversation. I remember thinking, this is actually something that I can definitely learn from. When it comes to the sort of the journey that you started on and like reflecting on it, as you said you did when you came in the car, I know you had a co-founder at the beginning as well, and like all good co-founder stories, sometimes they are amazing and they work, and other times not great, I guess, like all good marriages, I would say.
I assume so.
Yeah, or friendships, let's say. So tell me a little bit about that, because I do think there's something that sometimes we don't necessarily talk about, the fact that sometimes it is seen as a failure, but it can also propel you forward. So I'm really interested to hear about that journey for you and where it's taken you to.
Yeah, we actually had a couple. So there is me and also my husband, Justin. Not a lot of people know that we are a husband and wife team, and that's probably something unique in its own right, that not many startups have that kind of foundation. But we teamed up with a friend of ours when we were doing this museum app idea, and that obviously didn't last more than a couple of months before we all recognised that wasn't going to go anywhere, and all sort of went our own ways and recognised that wasn't the right idea and the right problem and solution. And then we'd started off looking into the data analytics space and that same thing in the visitor attractions industry. And a former colleague of mine from my days at one of the software companies reached out and said, "Hey, I heard you're working on this thing, and it's an interest of mine as well." He had some passion and had done some training in the BI space and was looking to sort of scratch that itch. So I spent a couple of hours a week for us in the first year or so of getting the company up and running and getting up to that first round of angel investment, at which point things went south and we ended up going our separate ways.
Ouch. And did you see that coming? Is it something that you're like, is it a feeling? Is it an instinct? Is it really obvious? I mean, everyone's going to have a different story here, but for you, how did that play out?
I mean, I think in those early days, you kind of imagine this future of this company that you might have, but it is a dream and a whim. And so you don't, I think through the realities of what a lot of that is going to look like, and a lot of the seriousness of what you're getting into. And at the same time, you probably can't afford to spend that much time navel gazing on that sort of thing, because you've really just got to get up and get going and test out and see whether your idea has got legs. But the reality is that it is a marriage. I was very lucky in that I was already married to one of my co-founders. With our co-founder, I'd worked together with him, although never in the same team. So I kind of felt like I knew him professionally, but perhaps we didn't have a lot of those deep and meaningfuls that we really needed to. And I think one of the hard things for founders when they're starting a business is that they all go into it with a really different idea of what real life is going to be like on the other side. And the problem with that is that founder life is very flashy on social media.
Yeah.
I saw a founder of another startup post a couple of weeks ago, and they were saying, founder life isn't like it is on the social media, and then went on to talk about their travel here and their speaking slot here and their press interview here and this long lunch here. And I was like, well, this is kind of the problem, right? Like, founder life is grind. And there is years of it ahead. And so what happened for us was, after we did this Angels round, and sort of the time was nigh for everybody to jump in full time if they weren't already, in full time, and Founderland being, of course, the 100-hour week kind of thing in the early days. This person didn't want to go more than a couple of hours a week, and then that became a trouble, and then sort of making it to the AGM became a trouble, and at the same time didn't want to release the reins on some of the team, like technical direction, which became a trouble. And it got to the point where it was causing a huge amount of noise with very little to no value. And at that point, we sort of called it and said, hey, look, you've got your shares. They had vested, unfortunately, by that stage, and let's call it a day. From there, things went even further south, and we ended up in court many years later. So it was a very long, drawn-out, very hard process for everyone involved.
Yeah, I mean,
Sounds like a divorce, really, doesn't it?
It does sound like. I mean, are you seeing or you hearing sort of things like that as well? Well, what sort of advice do you give to founders about the potential of it working or not working?
Well, I think the marriage analogy is a pretty good one. It's probably easier to get divorced than it is to split up as a founder, because you've got all these legal constructs, like additional legal constructs like ESOP and clawbacks and all sorts of other provisions, and you end up in court like you have. So I do think you have to take it really seriously. When I go to incubators or sort of different kind of scenarios like that, I always offer a $1,000 bet to the founding team that they won't be together in 5 years. And I've been offering that to lots of teams, and it's probably been, no one's ever taken me up on it. So it just tells you that it's always on the back of people's minds, but as per Angie's comment, you typically don't have the luxury of exploring, going on holidays together a few times and all of these things to test out whether you travel well together, or you've got similar biorhythms or whatever the things are. And so you end up straight into the grind, and you don't really find out till later. But I totally agree with your implication there, which is we don't talk about it anywhere near enough. We don't talk about it enough on this podcast.
No.
It's not enough of a part of the narrative.
Because you are then, I mean, Angie, you've done an incredible job with the culture of Dexibit. You can see it, and you can see how you could get your team jump on webinars, and they've got this incredible passion. And I guess in your mind, you're also thinking about how you're protecting that as you're going through this process, right? Because like another analogy, you want to keep the kids out of it, and you want to keep them happy, and you want to keep them focused on a happy life. Did you feel that was, something that was front and centre in your mind, that you were thinking, hang on, this is not the culture I'm trying to create. I want something which is much better for the future. I mean, talk a little bit to me about the culture of what you've got with Dexibit at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, that was definitely the big thing for us at that sort of crunch point when everything came to a head was the team sort of getting pulled in different directions. They would have conversations and strategies and make decisions, and then have an outside voice who wasn't participating in those coming in to disrupt that, and that was really difficult for them. So that was definitely a big part of the situation at the time. And then obviously, like you say, you want to protect the kids as you go through. Our culture's definitely had a number of iterations, and I think the pandemic's really shifted a lot of that over the years. But these days has a very tight feel. Like, we are people who have gone through hard things together, and I think that has made us really strong as a close-knit group. We are fairly casual internally in terms of the structures that we have, the processes that we have. That casualness isn't something that necessarily would work for everyone, and it wasn't how we started out either. Things like, we don't have a huge roadmap that's incredibly detailed. We tend to learn on the fly and keep things fairly loose. So those are the sorts of things that have worked for us in terms of like our decision making and things. But at the heart of that has always been a care for people and communication and values together, and I think that's held us strong over the years.
And how does a team deal with the fact that your co-founder is also your husband? So that obviously creates a special situation generally. And then how have you found working with your husband? So, obviously at work and then at home, presumably you talk about work. So just talk us through those two issues.
Yeah, we try our best to keep the two relatively separate. We have a rule that we don't talk about bad work things at home, which of course we break constantly. But, at least one of us can call it and say, "Hey, this is not how I wanted to wake up in the morning," because I think otherwise it is easy to sit in a constant board meeting essentially. And the flip side of that is that we try not to bring too much of home to work. So we don't sort of we're not husband and wife at work, because in a small team that could get fairly awkward fairly quickly. That's become a little bit more challenging since we've become parents, and there's sometimes a toddler running around the office occasionally. But I think that sort of together with other parents in the office, that's kind of been okay. So we've made it work.
Yeah, I mean, I've worked with my husband on and off for many years, and I found it actually, particularly when there have been kids involved, it's actually been really helpful in many ways. And I think you're right, Angie, you've got to really be able to separate that. But when you're cracking open a bottle of wine and it's been a bad day and you want to have a chat with somebody, it's someone that you can trust, I think is really powerful. I'm really interested in that culture piece though, Angie, because I feel like sometimes you sort of flippantly sort of said it's just the way that it is. But I think it comes from the top in many ways. It comes from how you and Justin have decided to lead this business. And you can really see that. When you're giving sort of advice to people about sort of setting the values of your business or setting the tone, and I know that you've gone for a casual one, what sort of advice do you give founders or people that are asking you about that in relation to culture and making sure that people have a great place to work?
I think one of the things that I learned the hard way was to invest in yourself as a leader is probably the best dollar you can spend in leadership development. And I think that that's hard for founders because we often feed ourselves last. So when we think about investing in leadership, we think about investing in everybody else's leadership development. But the reality is that your leadership development will probably have more impact on your team than anything else. And for me, what that looked like was, and Justin as well, we both did the same thing at separate times. We did a leadership course with someone called Sandy Burgum, and it was, I was kind of expecting it to be very sort of focused on management, like what's the strategy, what's the values, that sort of thing. And instead it was very, very internal, very introspective. It was like about shadows and masks and our childhood and group therapy and all sorts of things. It probably wouldn't have been what I would have signed up for if I'd known what I was in for, but in actual fact was that really what I needed and what we both needed. you bring so much of yourself into your role in a startup when you're leading it, because it is all consuming of you. And so to show up as your best self that you can, to not get in your own way, those are really, really important aspects as a leader. And it helps you make sure that you're not too distant, not too formal, not too structured, and that you do recognize the intimate, personal demands that being a leader in a startup requires of you.
Is there a specific habit or insight or tool that you've used to implement that? There's the kind of the realization you might have had in that leadership course, but then is there something that's helped you actually implement it on the ground inside Dexibit?
Oh, so many things. There were some very hard disciplines, like for pretty much a year we were journaling 3 pages a night and meditating for 15 minutes a day, which I found both those things pretty challenging. There was a lot of practice around shadows and masks for anyone
Do you want to
interested.
explain that a
Talk
little
us through
bit?
that, Ange.
Organizational psychology. So a mask is like a way that we want to be perceived by others. And it can be different at home and in the workplace. So, for example, one of my masks that I wear often, so embarrassing to admit to in public, is the mask of calm. And in this course, actually, they handed out some masks, like the white masks, and you had to write on your mask what your mask was. So I wrote calm, big, vivid marker across the forehead of this mask. And my toddler now has this mask as one of his toys and insists on wearing it around the house, which is a bit of a harassment to be followed by the thing that you're trying not to be. But where this, and it sort of helps you to work through like where these came from. Like for me, in my childhood, I was involved in Coast Guard. And so there was a lot of like extreme medical emergencies where I had to be calm for the sake of the patient or whatever situation we were in. And similar things like that happened that sort of ingrained this into my personality, and it was about how I showed up as a leader. And sometimes that was a good thing, like when you're in the middle of a pandemic and you're trying to lead people through day to day of how this is going to impact them and your industry and the business and everything else. And sometimes it's really bad because people don't know when you're angry, and therefore they don't know when you're happy because the face is kind of the same. And behind everybody's masks sits a shadow, which is the kind of the reverse of what you're trying to suppress and reject in yourself, and therefore what you reject in other people and see as bad or wrong. And for me, the opposite of calm is like reactive. And so if I saw someone on the team, particularly if they were in a leadership role who was like reacting very emotionally, very raw to what was happening, I would kind of look down upon that.
Right.
And which is terrible of me to do that to somebody else's way in which they're showing up. And also rejecting some of that in yourself is taking away from your own leadership. It's sort of creating distance between yourself and others. So this was one of the core skills that I learned, was about like how to recognize these things in ourselves. It requires some really deep work. But it fundamentally changes who you are as a leader, and for me, like as a wife and a mother and everything else as well. So I found it an exceptionally useful tool.
That's great, great storytelling and pretty useful tools, as you're saying, for leadership development. Interested in if you've met, presumably over the last few years, you've met a whole lot of other founders who are very early in their journey, might be 5-10 years behind you. Is there any specific leadership advice that you provide them, or things you consider? Obviously, there's the masks and shadows considerations, but is there something you see quite commonly in some of these startup founders?
Yeah, I think there's a huge difference between the branding that Silicon Valley and increasingly so New Zealand puts out into the startup theatre, if we're allowed to use that word.
You are. This is a safe space for using that.
Of like this go, 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 rah, rah, rah kind of brand of that's the only way to be a founder, that's the only way to be a startup. it's a very masculine view of the world. I think it's sort of a risk profile that works in some markets and not others, and it's not the only way to do things. And so I think when you see founders who are earlier on in their journey who are trying to be that when they're not that, I feel sad for them that they feel the need to be pressured into that. I want to encourage them to sort of relax into being who they are as a leader and as a founder, and what they want for their company and their culture, because we don't all need to be like that. And I think that that's probably one of the things I would like to see changed about our industry.
So where do you go from there? I mean, you use the word startup grind, which we're open to renaming our podcast.
We should, yeah.
Yeah, we should. Troy's away.
Yeah.
So
it's a grind.
Which is probably more accurate, but that's probably still a masculine term, I would have thought. And also it still boxes you into, this is pretty much what startups are like. So how do you, so if you try and reframe what you just said, you're trying to move away from the startup theatre and the sort of parody of itself, which seems to be true in our ecosystem or in startups generally. Where do you go with this kind of, make your own journey of your startup, knowing that for most people it still is a grind in the end?
Yeah, I think that vision can still be painted with imagination and creativity, but it doesn't need to be like a very forceful one. One of the things we've always prided ourselves in is making sure that the projections that we put out are realistic. They're not just like, here's I can draw a picture of a hockey stick as good as the next person. Doesn't necessarily mean that in the early days of the startup you can stand behind those numbers. So making sure that they are realistic. Sometimes you pay a penalty for that because everybody else is painting hockey sticks, so all of the people on the receiving end of them feel that they should sort of halve it again, and then they get to the actual. So if they do that with your numbers that you've got more evidence behind, that can be a penalty to you. Yeah, I think sort of getting into some of these things about how you execute on that vision, it doesn't all need to be from the top. Leader at the front, all of the rest of it. You can bring in lots of different leadership styles into the culture of your organization, and you'll attract the right people for you and repel the ones that doesn't work for in the long term, and that will help create and shape the culture of your team.
That's such a good point. Because have you got team sort of situated globally, Ange? How does it work for you at the moment? We got teams based around the world?
We used to pre-pandemic, and we brought that back to New Zealand. Yep. I never would have believed pre-pandemic that would work for our sector and for our sales motion and success motion, but it actually does. Having said that, we have had a few team members who have decided to move out of Auckland, which I've been really happy for them in doing that. So we've supported them. We just had a team member who moved to Queensland, for example. So we've got a couple of people working remotely like that, but sort of all based out of Auckland as sort of home base, if you like.
Got it. Because you've got a really interesting scaling story. I mean, obviously your customers are all over the world, which is, remarkable. We talk about the Smithsonian and the time that was spent for you in the States. How does it work, and how do you get that balance, and how often are you? So we talk about the pandemic, but there's lots of, dare I say it, positives that have come out of the pandemic in terms of being able to jump on different types of calls and be able to touch base with your customers a lot easily. But how much time and effort is this with you and the team spent in front of your clients and with your clients, and what does that mean for you on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, I mean, it's still the case that we need to meet our customers for sales and success touch points, and the reality is that means doing that in their business operating hours. I cringe when I hear some, young founders who are starting out with an American customer base and then telling them about what times they're available, without sort of thinking about the ramifications of that for the East Coast, or even worse, like sending them their Calendly and asking them to book in. Just makes me cringe. So the reality of this is that we get up super early in the morning, and that's something that we advertise when we recruit for customer-facing roles, that this is an early bird's role. I was up at 3 a.m. this morning. 4 a.m. is quite typical for me. Unfortunately, that's become a Sunday thing as well, because your body sort of settles into that after a while. But I don't mind it. I try and keep as healthy as I can on every other front in my physical self, so that I can cope with the pressures that puts on sleep. So I'm in bed most nights by 8 p.m.
Which works well for a toddler, I'm hoping.
It does.
Yeah.
It does.
And what does it for you? I mean, that's really interesting in terms of the way you've been working like a DJ, like a disc jockey, up at 3 a.m. doing the work. How do you get that balance, though? Are you finding that you get the downtime that's required for you and your family and everybody else in the weekends? Or is it sort of something that you really closely manage? Because I expect that you're right, you need to keep yourself healthy and healthy of mind, but it is really important for your role to be up at that time for your customer. How do you get the balance to catch up with friends, to be around for family? How does that work for you and for the rest of the team?
Yeah, I think as a founder for the first few years, it's important that you go hard, and you have to give it, 1,000% and beyond. And there were certainly exceptionally long, I can't even think about how many hours a week we were doing back in those days, and there was no time for anything else whatsoever. But you can only keep that up for so long. And so whilst it's important in the early days to give it everything you've got to get things off the ground, at some point you have to settle into a more sustainable life, and also recognize that a startup is, it is a 10-year horizon and beyond, to reach where you want to go. And you can't spend that much of your life only focused on one thing.
Yeah.
So for me, for example, that was, the decision to have a family, at some point that sort of demanded on my time. I was once, spending a month in New Zealand and a month in DC and then flipping back to New Zealand and then back to DC. I can't do that anymore, and with a toddler in tow. I am a little bit more protective over my sleep these days. When I have a couple of health issues with Sjogren's disease and palindromic arthritis, and these days when I feel an inflammation, sort of a flare-up coming on, I do take a little bit of time where I used to push through, because I know that I've got to sustain myself, for the long term, rather than sort of get into burnout territory. And I think that, whilst those things you can push for the first few years, at some point you've got to transition into what works for you.
Well, obviously you've got a perspective of the long term. Do you want to tell us a little bit about what that might look like for Dexibit? So if you look in the long term, 5-year horizon, what will be different about your business? What will be different about your customer's business? And where do you hope Dexibit will be?
Well, I think the big question mark in that tent is where data and AI is going, because that has been the most exciting part of our journey so far. Is when we started off, we were envisaging a dashboard with some data on it. And I pulled out our MVP the other day and just about died of embarrassment looking at it. But
you're not the only one,
product,
I can assure you.
Started off as something you later embarrassed of. And, if a year or two down the track, one of our customers said, well, if we can analyze the past, surely we can predict the future. And we went, oh, yeah, that sounds pretty good. And then another customer said, well, if we can attack quantitative data, what about the qualitative? And we thought, oh, that sounds like a pretty cool idea. And of course, that got us into machine learning and natural language. And these days, AI is an inherent part of everything that we do. We had a vision early days back then of the idea of conversational insight, and these days it's a reality where
Totally.
I can type in, I'm interested in my members who haven't visited in the last 3 months but are about to renew and have been a member for more than a year, and hit the magic wand and get some data out, which is pretty cool. So I think that seeing how that space evolves is especially important. Our thesis is that if we come back to that problem space, that complex problem, visitor attractions are complicated business models. They sell tickets, they have retail stores, they've got cafes, they do events. Maybe you can hire them out for weddings or corporate conferences, and they've got memberships and everything else, and donations and advancement and education and so forth. And when you get into the data and AI space, the more sort of complex that business model, the more value you add in the way that you utilize data and AI, whether that's through something like a semantic layer or whether that's through how you sort of train up that AI. For example, we've got customers who deal with like slavery and human rights, and you can't go to a museum and say, I came to the museum and I had a great time. The coffee was quite bad, but I really walked away with understanding better the role that Hitler played in the world, and then call that a positive review. Like you have to really bring a lot of context into that problem space. So this is our thesis longer term, is that that the more value you can bring into that AI piece, the better. And you can only really do that in a vertical, and only really do that where the problem that you're solving is a hard problem to solve. As a company, we've taken on venture capital, so at some point that capital will be looking for exit. As a growth trajectory, we were at rapid pace before the pandemic, took a huge hit during the pandemic, and then have very proudly, very efficiently grown out of that, grown back and now standing on our own 2 feet, which I think is a really powerful place to be in this market.
Great. How have your customers reacted to the AI stuff overall? Are they enthusiastic about the possibilities? Are they nervous? Do they see it as a game changer for what they might be able to offer the world beyond perhaps what Dexibit does? What's been the attitude of these institutions?
Yeah, they're all very curious about it. There's some pragmatic realities of it. Like, for example, these days, a lot of visitors to attractions don't land on their website. And so things like, what are the opening hours, might be a question that's answered either by conversational insight in Google search or even in like something like a chat GPT. And so they have no control over that conversation, and they have no visibility over it. They can't metric it. So there is some pragmatic realities there. But there's also some great problems that they've struggled to solve forever. Like if you're an art gallery and you're sitting on 100,000 pieces or more of art, it's very valuable to say, for example, the blind community, to have those described so that they can experience them with audio description, or very useful, for example, for search, to have that metadata, but would take you forever to do. So being able to use AI to, say, for example, generate an audio or a text description is incredibly powerful. So lots of different jobs that AI can do in the sector. But they are also quite cautious. This is an industry that's got its roots in academia. They're mindful of ethics, of environmental issues, of making sure that they've got solid policy. One of the things that has shifted things along, though, is the US federal government position, which has ramped up over the Biden and now the Trump administration on how bullish they are of AI in the federal space, and that certainly helped things along.
And I was thinking about something this morning when I knew I was going to be talking to you, and basically the toaster broke, and I was like, the kids were yelling at me going, well, what are we going to have for breakfast, right? You forget about how these things become incredibly sticky in your life and so important. And I was thinking about actually what you've done with the Dexibit and enabled it to be incredibly sticky for these, for the Smithsonian and the others to use it in your product. Do you have like a pipeline of other clients that you've got lined up right now, or your perfect next step for you in terms of who you would like to get on board?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we are as much a sales organisation as we are a success and product one. So we are always working on progressing and growing our pipeline. We have sort of customers that fall into a couple of categories, probably like any kind of mid-market play. There's the ones that go through the perfect cycle. For us, that's like maybe 3 to 4 months, sometimes as short as a couple of weeks, have 3 to 4 conversations with us over the course of that, where we discover their problem space, they discover our solution and get a demo of it. We talk through the realities of onboarding and things and quotes and contracts. And then, of course, there's the ones that you've been working on for years,
Yeah.
that you've got to sort of tickle the snails on. But yeah, we try and operate as much as possible on that sort of efficient SaaS pipeline. One of the changes in the last few years for us is pre-pandemic, we had a sales team, and now we're very much reliant on founder-led sales. It's sort of been part of that piece of becoming as efficient as possible. It is incredibly expensive to have a sales team in the US, and it's a high effort, limited return game, depending on how much money you've got to throw at the growth problem. And when you're trying to do that organically, like we are, you start to question some of those dollars. Like, I think the average tenure of a sales director in the US is something like 18 months, and the first 3 are onboarding. The last 3, they're kind of got their eyes on the door. And so you get that sort of maybe a year's worth of return in the middle. Salaries these days are like $150,000 US, plus you're putting benefits over the top. It's a hard game to make it work without huge amounts of venture capital. And in this day and age, I think you've just got to think a little bit more creatively about that.
But I think that founder-led sales piece is quite interesting. Serge, are you sort of seeing that as something which is more common as you're building your business? I know that I've previously in startups, we've hired salespeople thinking it was the right move, but actually fundamentally it hasn't worked in some areas. I'm quite interested in what your thoughts are as well.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything Angie has just said. I do think the return on investment for many sales hires, particularly in America where they're very expensive, they're very good at selling themselves, is pretty challenged. I think with the advent of AI and a whole lot of sales automation tools, you can scale founder-led sales a bit more. So you can do more outreach, you can automate some more of the journey. And I do think especially enterprise buyers do want to engage with founders where possible, and you can go quite far with it. So yeah, I do think some of the folklore of the last 20 years of SaaS is probably eroding a little bit, and it's not as critical, even though at some point you might need to do so. It's not as critical to bring these enterprise big hitters early on, and I think that's changing. And I just think with AI, again, it's just there's going to be a lot more grey area. That's my view.
Yeah, that's true. Angela, listen, one of the most favourite parts we have in our podcast, by the way, to keep it nice and simple, is what we call the Quickfire questions. And I've got a few for you. I'm hoping that you're okay if I bring up my phone and I start asking them because they're amazing. Now, these Quickfire questions, pretty much as we say, please, Serge, add any if you want to.
I shall.
Okay. What's a mistake you'll never make again as a founder?
Oh.
Quick fire, Ange.
Now I've got to put quick. Not having a prenup with co-founders, and making sure those founder early vesting, a long vesting period. I think it's very easy to look at vesting as this isn't very quick. It's easy to look at vesting as a founder and think about what's in it for me. I want my shares to vest as quickly as possible. It's actually a protection for co-founders between each other, and a commitment to have between each other to have longer vesting periods.
Yeah, and it's mutual, as you said, right? It's not just the other person's likely to turn out to be the psycho or the pathetic one or whatever, but it's actually you might change your mind, you might decide to move to the Maldives, you might decide you want to be a crochet professional. It's fine. You just need protections on both sides.
That is true. Okay, here's another one. Being the data girl that you are, data or instinct, what do you trust more when you're making those big calls?
I think data is good for diagnosis. I still refer to my gut when I make decisions once they are informed. And then I think as well, the culture piece that you brought in earlier, like all 3 of them have got to work in harmony. I don't believe that one is the other, one or the other. I think you've got to bring it all together to make it work.
Career advice to your 16-year-old self or your 16-year-old daughter when she turns that age, what would it be?
You know, I wouldn't change anything for the world. I think all of the rabbit holes in life lead you in the right direction. But I do like to kind of think about what if the 16-year-old me got a glimpse of the 40-year-old one and what she was up to and who she'd become. And And I think sometimes that's worth thinking about, to give yourself that perspective of where we're at in life. It's easy to judge ourselves, and sometimes sort of thinking about what would 16-year-old me see is a little bit of a cool thought.
I like it. One boardroom red flag you've learned to spot quickly. I know you've got a board meeting coming up, so let's think.
If you're having the same conversation more than once, and particularly if it's repeated, something's broke.
Great one.
What about found a life in one word? You said grind before. You can't say that.
It might be a cliche, but very true for my industry. Is a roller coaster. You can have the best of the best and the worst of the worst within an hour of each other, and it does truly feel like that on the ground.
One specifically for you, if you had to prioritise working on the mask or the shadows, which one would you go for? And
the
why?
gold's always in the shadow. I think by practicing living in your shadow, which for me, for example, is that reactive self, like letting some of that come out and letting people see it, that's what makes you a better leader, not concentrating on who you want people to see you as.
Too true. So you're being really open with us, but quick question for you in terms of this. What's the most unexpected thing that's inspired you lately? And that can be anything, Ange.
Probably some of your listeners out there might have picked up on what I've been through personally in the last year or so, and going through the criminal justice process. And
do you want to just colour? Do you want to colour that in?
Yeah, tell us a little bit
about that. It's not the short
that.
answer, but just colour that in a little bit.
It's not a quick fire question.
Yeah,
I ended up taking my former best friend to the police. And they investigated him and found him, the court eventually found him guilty of intimate visual recording and other crimes against women and children, 24 of us that they know of. And for me, it was a reminder that we can do really, really hard things, and that there is a lot of good that can come from leaning into really difficult conversations and really difficult things to tackle. And I made the decision to drop my name suppression and talk about it in public, because it is an issue that hasn't really been explored. People don't know a lot about intimate visual recording and digital sex crime in general. And it's with AI, it's going to be worse and worse and worse, unfortunately. And it is something that we all need to talk about. And so I guess the inspiration in that for me is, when you're staring at the mountain, when you're staring at the hole, you can do really hard things and to believe in yourself.
100% agree. And, that's something that people have been obviously coming to you and talking about. So there's kudos to you, Ange, for doing that. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, awesome.
Thank you for also talking about it as well. A little bit lighter. You're in a museum. It's late at night. You're stuck in there. Where are you going first?
It sure as hell is in the basement. Those
yeah,
things
no way.
are creepy in the daytime. Although full of amazing things. Like, there is nothing like going into a museum basement and having the curators pull open the big sliding drawers and show you just the coolest things in the world. I would head straight for the director's office. Bougie art,
right.
Luxurious surroundings and good snacks. Yeah, that's where you'd find me.
Okay, and finally, most famous thing you've actually seen that we would all know. You'll be like, I've actually gone in and touched it, held it, looked at it.
Oh my goodness, there's so many. Harry Potter's wand. Batman's car.
Batman's car? This is so lucky you've got a 3-year-old son.
They chop the heads off the historic royal palaces, like the bit where you put your head and the axe comes down. I forget what it's called. I should know.
Guillotine?
The guillotine?
Yes. Yeah, I was actually in the room where I forget the name of the Queen.
Was it Anne Boleyn?
Who died during childbirth, and Tom Jones was singing outside. He was doing like some rehearsal at Hampton Court. I think that was the day that I came to see you for dinner, Age. In London. Yeah. So I've seen like the most bizarre things and had the weirdest experiences.
And it's been an absolute pleasure, as always. I mean, obviously we've known each other for a long time, and we've followed each other's journey for a really long time. And it's been such a pleasure actually having you join us today, because so many people have wanted to hear about your journey. And I think that's the part which is really exciting when New Zealand is a small place in many ways. I mean, Serge and I were at university together, for example, and we've known each other a very long time. But I think it's really lovely to have someone like yourself come on, Ange, not only as a female founder, but as a founder in general of a very successful New Zealand SaaS company, which we're all inspired by. And we know that Justin is the incredible person behind the scenes as well. It's always good to hear about the number two. I think that Rowan Simpson talks about the strong number twos. And I think that it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for being so open and honest and endearing. And it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ange. Thanks for coming on Startup Theatre.
Well, Serge, I mean, let's just face it. Should we tell Troy not to come back? That was incredible.
Yeah, what a great conversation. I just thought it was raw and honest, and touched on lots of personal themes, and which obviously in a founder's journey, yes, there's the business you're building. If you're building a product or a technology, that's important, but it's a personal journey. It's obviously made more so when you have challenges with your founder or co-founder, when you're married to another of your founders, and then in the meantime, you've got obviously having children and have a legal case on the go. So, yeah, it's a real personal, raw story. I thought it was excellent. And I'm glad we didn't have Troy sort of ruin it.
Yeah, he wouldn't have understood the mask thing.
Yeah.
He would have confused him. He'd be like, what mask?
Yeah, there's no mask. And then it's like, is it our mask?
Yeah, he'd be true.
What mask
It'd
is
be
he talking
confusing
about?
for him. But I did find that really interesting, because I talked to a lot of founders around the types of support and development they have, and I wasn't really expecting to hear that, but actually it's really interesting, isn't it? Because you do have to turn up on the worst days and be the best person sometimes, and how do you manage that when you've had the conversation on the board overnight, you're getting your ass kicked, you've got to turn up and make sure that you're kind of keeping everyone on point, and actually being able to kind of sort of the stuff that Ange was talking about, really build on that and really dig deep to understand it, I thought was really interesting.
Yeah, and we often lose sight of that. There's the founder journey, the visionary, the person who brings the energy all the time, but there's a leadership, becoming a better leader journey going on at the same time, and we don't talk about that enough either. No,
I don't. I think you're right. I mean, Dexibit has been around. I mean, they won the High Tech Awards a few years back down in Christchurch. They've been around for a while, and they are sort of, so they haven't slipped under a radar necessarily, but they have been just silently getting better,
grinding away.
Yeah, and grinding away and getting better and better, and that's kudos to Ange, Justin, and the team that have done that. And I think it's I know that everyone has been wanting to have Ange on for a long time, and I think she's outdone herself. I just loved it.
Yeah, it's a great conversation. So thanks for joining us on Startup Theatre. We'll see you next time.